The piece of paper was barely larger than a man's thumb, folded twice, and pressed into Phineas Shepard's palm by a stranger who was already more dead than alive when he found him face down in the red Nevada dust on the afternoon of September the 3rd, 1872. Phineas had been riding the long trail back from Carson City, his saddlebags light and his mood lighter, having delivered a herd of 40 longhorns to a buyer who paid fair and didn't argue about the count. He was 26 years old, lean as a fence post, with dark eyes that had seen enough of the West to know when something required stopping and when it was best to keep riding. This time he stopped. The man was lying near a dry creek bed, one hand stretched forward as though he had been crawling toward something that kept retreating. His shirt was soaked through at the back, and Phineas understood before he even dismounted that whatever had happened here, there would be no fixing it. He swung down from his bay gelding, Atlas, and crouched beside the man, rolling him gently onto his side. The man's face was weathered and gray, somewhere in his late 40s or early 50s, with a thick mustache gone mostly white and eyes that were still working hard to stay open. His lips moved before Phineas could say a word. "You are a real person," the man rasped. "Not the devil, thank the Lord." "I am as real as dirt," Phineas said quietly. "What happened to you?" "Doesn't matter," the man swallowed with effort. "My horse threw me, hit a rock 2 days ago." He coughed, and it was a terrible sound. "I have been lying here 2 days." Phineas glanced around. There was no horse in sight, no water, no shelter. The Nevada sun in September was not quite as merciless as it was in July, but 2 days without water in this country was a death sentence written in very clear language. He uncorked his canteen and held it to the man's lips, and the man drank with the desperate gratitude of someone who had already been measuring his own last hours. "I need you to do something for me," the man said when he had caught what breath he could. "I don't have time to explain all of it. There isn't time for all of it." "Tell me what you need," Phineas said. The man's right hand moved toward his coat pocket, fumbling, and Phineas helped him, reaching in and finding the small folded piece of paper. The man closed his fingers around Phineas's hand, and the grip was surprisingly strong for a dying man. "Her name is on that paper," he said. "Lydia Covington. She is in Texas, somewhere near the Brazos River country last I knew, but that was 8 months ago and she may have moved on. She doesn't know that I am gone. She needs to know." He paused, laboring. "She needs to know that the land in her mother's name is rightfully hers. The deed is with a lawyer named Aldous Webb in Waco. I paid him to hold it. She doesn't know about it. Her mother died in the spring and she never got the letter I sent." "Who are you to her?" Phineas asked. "Her father's brother," the man said. "Her uncle, Edmund Covington." He tried to squeeze Phineas's hand harder. "There are men who will try to take that land if she doesn't claim it. She has until the spring, 1874, or the deed reverts to county claim. That is what Webb told me. She has to know." Phineas looked at the paper in his hand. 2 words in faded pencil: Lydia Covington. "I will find her," he said, and he meant it simply and without drama because that was the kind of man he was. Edmund Covington's eyes held steady on his face for a long moment, reading him with whatever judgment a man has left at the end. Then something in them relaxed, like a rope finally allowed to go slack. "You have a good face," Edmund said. "I would not have trusted a man with a bad face." He died 18 minutes later, quietly, with Phineas sitting beside him in the Nevada dust, and the afternoon light going amber around them both. Phineas stayed until it was done, and then he did the work that needed doing, which was hard and took time. And when it was finished, he had a grave marked with a flat stone and a cross made of mesquite branches, and he carved Edmund Covington into the stone as best he could with his knife. He tucked the paper into his breast pocket, right against his heart, without quite knowing why he put it there specifically rather than anywhere else. He rode on toward the nearest town, which was a settlement called Millhaven, and he sent a wire to the only lawyer in Waco whose name he knew to ask about one Aldous Webb. The reply came back in 2 days confirming that Webb existed and was practicing law in Waco, Texas. That was enough to go on. The problem, of course, was that Phineas Shepard was not a wealthy man, and Texas was not around the corner. He had the money from the cattle delivery, and he had Atlas, and he had a bedroll and a Winchester rifle and a Colt revolver and the worn leather saddlebags that had been his father's. He also had a stubborn streak that people who knew him described variously as admirable and infuriating, often in the same breath. He wrote a short letter to his employer, a cattle rancher named Hollis Grant outside of Carson City, explaining that he would be unavailable for the fall drive and that he was sorry for the inconvenience. He did not explain why in detail because he was not entirely sure how to explain it in detail. A dying man asked me to do something, and so I am going to do it. That was the whole of it. He left Millhaven on a bright, cool morning in late September, riding southeast, and the great American landscape opened up before him like a story that had no interest in being brief. The journey from Nevada to the Texas Brazos country in 1872 was not a gentle undertaking. There were no railroads connecting those particular points conveniently, and while the transcontinental line had been completed 3 years prior, it ran a route that did not serve him directly. He rode through Utah Territory, where the high desert turned from red to pale gold, and the mountains sat on the horizon like sleeping giants. He pushed south and east through Colorado Territory, stopping in Pueblo to rest Atlas and resupply, sleeping in a boarding house that smelled of pine and boiled cabbage and was entirely satisfactory by the standards of the trail. In Pueblo he heard, over dinner at the boarding house table, that the Brazos River country of Texas was vast, hundreds of miles of rolling cross timbers and open prairie, scattered with small settlements and farms and the occasional larger town. He asked about a woman named Lydia Covington and got nothing but blank looks, which he had expected. He was not going to find her by asking in Colorado. He rode through the Texas Panhandle in November, which was cold and flat and spectacularly unimpressed with his presence. The wind came off the northern plains with a personal vendetta, and he wrapped himself in his wool coat and kept his hat pulled low and talked to Atlas about nothing in particular, which was something he had always done and was not ashamed of. He reached the outer edges of the Brazos River country in early December, and the land changed character entirely, rolling, tree-lined, the river itself cutting its brown generous way through limestone and clay, with farms and small ranches tucked into the bends and the bottomlands. It was prettier than he had expected, and greener even in December than Nevada ever managed. He started asking in earnest in the town of Comanche, then in Stephenville, then in a small settlement east of the Bosque River, where a storekeeper knew a family named Covington, or had known one, though the old man had died and the wife too, and he wasn't sure about any remaining kin. In Meridian he found a woman who had attended the same church as a Margaret Covington, who had been the mother, who had indeed died the previous spring of a fever that took her fast. The woman, a Mrs. Hattie Draper, round and serious and kind, told Phineas that she believed Margaret's daughter Lydia had been working as a schoolteacher somewhere near the river, in one of the smaller settlements. She thought the settlement might be called Crockett's Crossing, though she wasn't certain. There was no Crockett's Crossing on any map Phineas could find, but that was not unusual for 1872 Texas. Half the settlements in this country existed in reality but not on paper. He rode east along the river, stopping at farms and asking, and in mid-December he found a ferryman on the Brazos who knew exactly where Crockett's Crossing was, and had in fact just ferried a young schoolteacher across the river last week. A Miss Covington. He was fairly sure that was the name, though he admitted he wasn't strong on names. Phineas's heart did something he didn't particularly expect it to do, which was to speed up considerably. He crossed the river on the ferry, Atlas standing patient and stoic with his feet wide on the flat wooden boards, and he paid the ferryman and thanked him and rode the remaining 4 miles to Crockett's Crossing in the thin gold light of a December afternoon. Crockett's Crossing was not much to look at on its best day. It was a scattering of perhaps 40 or 50 souls, with a general store, a smithy, a small church that also served as the schoolroom during the week, 2 rows of modest wooden houses, and a livery stable that leaned slightly to the left as though it had been thinking about lying down for a while. The whole thing sat on a slight rise above the river bend, surrounded by post oaks and pecan trees that had gone bare and gray for the winter. Phineas rode in at a walk, because riding into a small settlement at a gallop was the kind of thing that made people reach for their firearms, and asked the first person he saw, a boy of about 12 leading a mule, where he might find the schoolteacher. The boy pointed at the church. Phineas dismounted, tied Atlas to the hitching post outside, and stood for a moment in front of the church door. He was aware suddenly of how he must look road-worn and dusty, 3 months on the trail, his coat faded and his boots cracked along the left toe, and his face carrying the kind of weathering that comes from sleeping under open sky in all seasons. He took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair, which accomplished very little. He knocked on the church door. There was a pause, and then the door opened, and Phineas Shepard, who had ridden over 1,000 miles across some of the most difficult country in North America, because a dying stranger had asked him to, looked at the woman in the doorway and understood in some wordless and irreversible way that the journey had been carrying him here even before Edmund Covington had handed him the paper. She was 23 years old, Lydia Covington, and she was not what he might have imagined if he had spent any time imagining, which he had told himself firmly he was not doing and had anyway. She was tall for a woman of the era, with dark auburn hair that had come loose from its pins in a couple of places, and brown eyes that were currently registering polite caution at the sight of a trail-worn stranger on the church doorstep. She was wearing a plain dark wool dress and had a piece of chalk still in her right hand, and there were 2 children visible behind her at wooden desks, staring at Phineas with the frank curiosity of children who don't yet know they're supposed to pretend not to stare. "Can I help you?" she said. Her voice was clear and steady, with that particular quality of someone who has made a practice of being unintimidated. "I am looking for Lydia Covington," he said. "You have found her," she said. "And you are." "My name is Phineas Shepard," he said. "I am sorry to come like this without any warning. I have something to tell you, and I am sorry because it is not entirely easy news, and I am sorry also for the state I am in. I have been on the road for about 3 months." Something shifted in her expression, not fear exactly, but the alertness of someone who recognizes that what is coming will require them to be strong. "You had better come in," she said. She sent the 2 remaining students home, telling them their lesson was done for the day, and they gathered their things and filed past Phineas with wide eyes and went out into the December afternoon. Then she turned back to him and folded her hands together in a way that he recognized as someone bracing themselves. "Tell me," she said. He told her everything, starting with the red Nevada dust and Edmund Covington's gray face and the piece of paper pressed into his hand. He told it plainly and without embellishment, because she did not look like a woman who wanted embellishment, and because the truth of it was already large enough on its own. He took the paper from his breast pocket and held it out to her, and she took it and looked at the 2 words written in her uncle's hand. She did not cry immediately. She held herself very still for a long moment, and then she sat down on one of the students' benches, and Phineas sat on the bench across from her and waited. "He was the only family I had left," she said after a while, "after my mother died in April." "I am sorry," Phineas said. "He knew I was here." "He said he had written you a letter. He said you never received it." She shook her head slowly. "Mail is unreliable out here. There is no regular post. I go into Meridian once a month for letters, and half the time there are none, and I have learned not to count on it." She paused. "He said there is land." "There is land," Phineas said, "and a lawyer in Waco named Aldous Webb who is holding the deed, and a deadline in the spring of 1874. That is what your uncle told me." She looked at the paper again, then up at him, and there was something in her face that was difficult to read but that he found himself wanting to understand completely. "Why did you come?" she said. "You didn't know him. You owe no obligation to a dead man you found on the road." It was a fair question, and Phineas considered it honestly. "He was dying and he needed something done," he said. "It seemed straightforward. You rode 1,000 miles because it seemed straightforward." "More or less," he said. "Closer to 1,100, I think." She looked at him for a long moment, and something in the careful set of her expression softened just slightly at the edges. "I don't know how to thank you for this," she said. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "I do," she said firmly. "And I will. But first, I think you need a meal and a place to sleep that isn't the ground. And in the morning we can think about what to do next." She arranged both of these things with the efficiency of a woman who was accustomed to managing things on her own. The meal came from a widow named Mrs. Pratt, who ran a boarding house that constituted one of the 2 rows of houses in Crockett's Crossing, and who produced a beef stew and cornbread that Phineas consumed in a quantity that embarrassed him slightly, and that Mrs. Pratt seemed to consider a profound personal compliment. The place to sleep was a room at the back of the boarding house that was clean, and had a real mattress and a window that looked out over the pecan trees going silver in the moonlight. He lay on that mattress that night, staring at the ceiling, and tried to have a rational conversation with himself about what he was feeling and what it meant. The conversation was largely unsuccessful. In the morning, Lydia was at breakfast before him, sitting at the long table in Mrs. Pratt's kitchen with a cup of coffee and a piece of paper on which she had been writing. She looked up when he came in, and he noticed, in the better light of morning, that her eyes were not quite simply brown. They had something of amber in them, particularly when the winter light came through the window at that angle. "I have been thinking," she said, "about what needs to happen next." "Tell me," he said, sitting down across from her and accepting the coffee Mrs. Pratt pressed into his hand. "I need to go to Waco," she said, "to see this lawyer and understand about the land. I cannot simply send a letter and hope for the best, not with a deadline involved." She looked at him steadily. "Would you be willing to accompany me? I know I am asking a great deal from someone who has already done far more than any reasonable person could be expected to do. But the truth is that I don't entirely know the country between here and Waco, and a woman traveling alone is not," she paused. "It is not always wise." "I will take you to Waco," Phineas said, without a moment's hesitation. She looked at him with that searching quality again. "You are very decided." "I find it saves time," he said. She smiled at that, quickly and a little surprised, and it was the first time he had seen her smile, and it did something to the light in the room that he could not have explained to anyone's satisfaction. They left Crockett's Crossing 2 days later, after she had arranged for another woman in the settlement, a Mrs. Aldgate, who had some education, to take her students for the 2 or 3 weeks she expected to be away. She rode her own horse, a reliable dark bay mare named Clara, who was somewhat smaller than Atlas but had, as Lydia noted with evident affection, the common sense of a horse twice her age. Lydia rode astride, which was practical on this terrain, and which she clearly did without apology. Phineas found that he liked her more with each passing hour, which was both a pleasant discovery and a somewhat alarming one. They rode toward Waco, which was roughly 100 miles southeast, through country that was by turns beautiful and austere. The winter grass was pale gold, and the post oak stood dark against it, and the sky was the particular deep blue that seems to belong exclusively to Texas in December. On the first night they camped near a tributary of the Bosque, and Phineas built a fire while Lydia set up what proved to be a very competent camp. She had a small canvas lean. To that she rigged efficiently between 2 trees, and she had packed food with the practicality of someone who knew exactly what trail life required. "How long have you been in Crockett's Crossing?" he asked as they ate over the fire. "Just over a year," she said. "I came when the settlement needed a teacher. I had done some teaching before back in Tennessee, which is where I am from originally. My parents moved to Texas when I was 17. You went from Tennessee to Texas to Nevada, he said, meaning the school job, meaning the trail, meaning the whole long chain of it. You went from Nevada to Texas, she pointed out. That is a far greater distance. I had a horse and nothing particular to hurry back for, he said. What do you do when you are not crossing half the continent delivering news to strangers? I work cattle, he said. I drive them, manage them, sometimes help with ranching operations when a spread needs an extra hand. I have been doing it since I was about 16. Do you like it? He thought about that honestly. I like the land, he said. I like being out in it. I like Atlas. The cattle themselves are, he considered, the cattle are a means to an end. She laughed softly. An honest answer. What do you like about teaching? He asked. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. The moment when something becomes clear to a child, she said, when you can see it happen on their face. They are struggling with something, a sum or a word they can't read, and then something in them clicks into place and you can see it, plain as anything. That. She looked up at him across the fire. That is the best thing. He held her gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then he looked at the fire too. The second day of riding was longer, and by mid-afternoon a cold front had pushed in from the north, dropping the temperature sharply and sending a thin sleeting rain across the land. They pushed on rather than camp early, and by the time they reached the town of Hillsboro, where they had agreed to stop for the night, they were both cold through, and Atlas was moving with the slightly indignant air of a horse who has tolerated enough for one day. The hotel in Hillsboro was plain but warm, and Phineas paid for 2 rooms without discussion, and Lydia accepted this also without discussion, and they ate supper in the small dining room where a wood stove put out enough heat to raise the recently deceased. The other diners were a drummer with a sample case and 2 cattle buyers passing through, and the conversation at the table was general and pleasant, and Phineas noticed that Lydia held her own in any conversation she was included in. She had opinions and she expressed them, which he found more attractive than he had any reason to be surprised by. After supper, in the lobby, waiting while Mrs. Garfield, the hotel proprietor, found the key to Lydia's room, Lydia turned to Phineas and said, "Can I ask you something personal?" "Yes," he said. "Is there anyone waiting for you, back in Nevada or anywhere else?" He looked at her directly. "No," he said. "There is no one." She nodded, and something in the way she nodded told him that the question had not been entirely idle. They reached Waco on the 4th day, riding into town in the mid-morning of a clear, cold day, the Brazos River wide and brown and moving steadily below the limestone bluffs. Waco was a real town by 1872 standards. It had been established decades prior, had grown with the cattle trade, and had streets with actual names and buildings with 2 floors and a courthouse that meant business. It was the largest town Lydia had been in for some time, and Phineas watched her take it in with the steady alertness he was coming to recognize as characteristic of her. Aldous Webb's law office was on 2nd Street, in a narrow building wedged between a dry goods merchant and a land surveyor, with a painted sign on the door that was precise about his credentials. Webb himself proved to be a thin man of about 60, with spectacles and ink-stained fingers and the slightly defensive manner of a lawyer who has been asked too many times in his career to do things that are not entirely above board. He was not defensive today. When Lydia presented herself and explained who she was and who had sent word of her, he became efficient and almost warm. He produced the deed from a strong box with the care of a man handling something fragile, and he spread it on the desk and explained it in plain language. The land was 40 acres on the north branch of the Bosque River, outside a small town called Valley Mills. It had belonged to Lydia's mother Margaret, who had inherited it from her own mother, and the taxes on it were paid through the spring of 1874, which was the deadline Edmund had spoken of. After that date, if no one came forward to claim it, the county would have grounds to absorb it. "Your uncle paid for the holding of this deed himself," Webb said, looking at Lydia over his spectacles. He came to me last February and paid a year's fee in advance. He said he wanted to be certain you would not lose this through ignorance of it. He paused. He seemed like a man who cared very much about doing right by his kin. Lydia's hands were very still on the arms of her chair. He was, she said quietly. Webb drew up the necessary transfer paperwork that afternoon, with Phineas witnessing and signing in the appropriate places. And by the time the late afternoon sun was stretching long shadows across 2nd Street, Lydia Covington was the rightful, legally documented owner of 40 acres of river bottomland on the north branch of the Bosque. She stood on the sidewalk outside Webb's office with the deed folded in her coat pocket, and Phineas stood beside her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. 40 acres, she said at last. It is a real thing, he said. Land you own free and clear. I have never owned anything, she said. Not truly. Not like this. She turned and looked at him, and her eyes were bright in a way that was not quite tears but was adjacent to them. You gave me this, she said. Your uncle gave you this, he said. I just delivered the news. You rode 1,100 miles to deliver it, she said. Phineas. It was the first time she had used his first name, and she said it like she had been thinking about how it would sound. Thank you. You are welcome, he said, and meant it with every bone in his body. They stayed 2 nights in Waco, which Phineas rationalized as being practical Atlas-needed shoes from the blacksmith. There were supplies Lydia needed to purchase, and they both deserved a day that did not involve spending all of it on horseback. But the truth, which he was beginning to have to be more honest with himself about, was that he did not want the ride back to Crockett's Crossing to happen yet, because at the end of it, he would be in a position where he needed to decide what to do next, and that decision was becoming complicated. On the 2nd day in Waco, Lydia hired a boy to watch their horses, and she took Phineas to look at the river from the limestone bluffs, because she had heard it was beautiful from up there, and she had wanted to see it since they arrived. They walked up through cedar trees and loose limestone, and she was right. The river below was wide and silver, and the surrounding land rolled out in every direction in a way that made the smallness of human concerns quite vivid. I have been thinking about the land, she said. The 40 acres. I want to see it. We could ride through Valley Mills on the way back, he said. It is not far from Meridian, which is not far from Crockett's Crossing. We could make a slight detour. You don't have to do that. You have already. I would like to see it, he said simply, if that is all right. She looked at him with that searching quality that he had stopped trying to be unaffected by. Why are you still here, she said, not meaning it unkindly, but you could have gone back to Nevada weeks ago. You delivered your message. Your obligation is done. He was quiet for a moment, watching the river below them move its slow silver way through the limestone country. I don't feel that it is done, he said. What does it feel like then? She asked. He looked at her. It feels like something that is just beginning, he said. The wind came off the river, lifting a strand of her hair across her cheek, and she reached up to tuck it back and looked at him steadily. And the whole wide winter landscape went very still around them in the way that landscapes sometimes do when they are paying attention. I think so too, she said. They rode out of Waco the following morning, and the road north and west through the hill country toward Valley Mills was quiet and golden and cold, and they rode side by side rather than in the single file that narrow trail demanded, and they talked for hours. He told her about growing up in Illinois, where his father had been a farmer, and how at 15 he had known with absolute certainty that he was not meant to stay in Illinois, and how at 16 he had ridden west and never looked back, and how he missed his father now that the man was 3 years dead, but did not miss Illinois even slightly. She told him about Tennessee, about a childhood that had been mostly good but had ended earlier than it should have when her mother's health began to fail, when Lydia had been the one who kept the household running at 14, 15, 16, while her father worked himself into an early grave. She told it without self-pity, which made it more moving than self-pity would have. You have been taking care of things on your own for a long time, he said. So have you, she said. It is different for a woman, he said. It requires more fighting, I think is the word, having to prove yourself over and over to people who would rather you weren't in the room. She looked at him with something that might have been mild surprise. Yes, she said, that is exactly the word. They reached Valley Mills in the late afternoon of a day that had turned unexpectedly warm, one of those Texas winter days that decide, briefly and seemingly on a whim, to impersonate spring. They found the 40 acres easily enough, following the directions that Webb had included with the deed, and when they reached the land, Phineas understood in the first 5 minutes why Edmund Covington had paid to hold this deed. It was beautiful country. The north branch of the bosque ran along its eastern edge, clear and steady, lined with cottonwoods that were winter bare but would be magnificent in the summer. The land itself was gentle and rolling, with deep grass even in December, and a small rise at the northern end that had a view clear to the limestone escarpment that marked the edge of the Edwards Plateau. There was a place near the river where someone, long ago, had built a stone foundation, never finished, never built upon, just the squared limestone corners of something that had been intended. Lydia stood in the middle of the land and turned in a slow circle, and the afternoon light was doing something remarkable with the dormant grass and the gray cottonwood trunks and the clear sky above, and Phineas stood a few steps back and watched her and felt something shift definitively inside him, like a keystone dropping into place in an arch. "It is real," she said, to no one in particular. "It is mine." "It is yours," he said. She turned and looked at him across the winter grass, and the distance between them was perhaps 10 steps, and the afternoon light was in her hair and her eyes were amber and brown and alive. And Phineas Shepard, who had crossed 1,100 miles of some of the most demanding landscape on the continent because a dying man asked him to, decided that he was going to stay. He did not say it yet, because the moment was hers and he was not going to crowd it. But he decided it, fully and without reservation, standing on her 40 acres of river bottomland in the thin December sun, and once decided it settled into him like something that had always been true. The ride back to Crockett's Crossing took 2 days, and they made camp on the first night near a bend in the bosque where the water ran over flat limestone, and the sound of it was constant and quiet and good. They built a larger fire than strictly necessary, because the night was cold and neither of them was in a hurry for the evening to end, and after supper they sat close to it and talked until the fire burned low. He told her about the worst storm he had ever ridden through, crossing the Sierra Nevada in the fall of '69, when the snow came sideways, and he had been pinned in a canyon for 3 days with only his horse and his supplies, and a very poor selection of reading material. Half a newspaper from 2 weeks prior, and a dime novel, whose plot he could no longer remember but whose cover had featured a woman in improbable dress waving a pistol. She laughed at that fully and warmly, and then told him about the time she had attempted to teach long division to a boy in her first school in Tennessee who was convinced that mathematics was a form of witchcraft, and how she had ultimately won him over by relating every sum to horses, which he cared about deeply. "He became quite a good mathematician," she said, "in the end." "You have patience," he said. "I have stubbornness," she said. "I think people sometimes mistake the two." "I have both," he said, "and I have given up pretending otherwise." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "What happens next, for you?" "That depends," he said, "on what you would like to happen." She turned to look at him, and the firelight moved on her face, and she said, "That is a very careful answer." "I am trying," he said, "to not be presumptuous about something I care a great deal about." "And what is it that you care a great deal about?" she asked, and her voice was very quiet. "You," he said, "staying where you are, having a reason to stay." She held his gaze, and the fire popped softly between them, and the river ran its constant note over the limestone. "I think," she said slowly, "that you would need to find something to do in this part of Texas." "I believe," he said, "that there is always work for a man who knows cattle in this part of Texas." "That is probably true," she said. "And there is 40 acres of river bottom land," he said, "that someone might want to make something out of eventually. "Someone might," she said, and there was the beginning of a smile at the corner of her mouth. "I am not rushing anything," he said carefully. "I know that I am essentially a stranger who turned up on your church doorstep 3 weeks ago." "You are not a stranger," she said. "Not anymore." She looked at the fire. "You have known me long enough to know that I am stubborn and that I have been managing alone for a long time and that I am not good at letting people stay." "I know those things," he said. "I am not asking to be let. I am asking only to be given the chance to earn it." She was quiet for a long time, and the fire burned down to coals, and the night deepened around them. "I think," she said at last, "that you already have more credit in that account than you know." They sat by the dying fire for another hour without saying much, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind that neither of them was in a hurry to fill. They arrived back in Crockett's Crossing on a Tuesday afternoon in late December, and the settlement looked slightly more festive than it had when they left. Someone had put pine boughs on the door of the general store, and there was the distant sound of a fiddle coming from somewhere. Mrs. Pratt was delighted to see them, and had apparently prepared for their return in the way that landladies do, which involved the imminent production of a large amount of food. Lydia went to reclaim her school and her life, and Phineas went to see about work. He found it in 3 days. A rancher named Jonas Birch, whose spread was 4 miles south of the settlement and who ran a respectable operation, had been looking for a reliable hand with experience in cattle management for the better part of 2 months. Phineas presented himself and his credentials, which were honest, and which Birch checked against references Phineas provided, and by the end of the week he had a place to sleep in the bunkhouse and work that suited him and wages that were fair. He told Jonas Birch that he intended to stay, and Birch, who had the seasoned eye of a man who has hired and lost a great many cowboys and knows the ones who mean it from the ones who don't, looked at him for a moment and said, "You have got some reason beyond the work." "I do," Phineas said. Birch nodded once. "That tends to make a man reliable," he said, and that was the end of the conversation. Christmas came to Crockett's Crossing quietly, the way it does in small settlements far from cities. There was a gathering at the church, with hymns and candles and food that the whole community contributed to, and children in their good clothes standing up straighter than usual. Phineas attended and found himself standing beside Lydia in the candlelight, and when they sang the familiar old hymns, her voice was true and unself-conscious, and he thought it was the most beautiful sound in the room. Afterward, in the cold, clear night outside the church, she took his arm as they walked, quite naturally, as though it had already been established between them, and he said nothing but held the moment carefully, the way you hold a thing you do not want to drop. January of 1873 settled into the routine of the working year, and Phineas found that working for Birch was satisfying in the way that honest physical work is satisfying. The land required things of you and you did them, and the doing had a clarity to it. He got along with the other 2 hands on the spread, a quiet man named Thomas Reeves who was from Georgia and had been in Texas since the end of the war, and a younger man of about 20 named Eli Craft who was enthusiastic about nearly everything and made it difficult to have a bad morning. He saw Lydia as often as their respective schedules permitted, which turned out to be most evenings when she did not have papers to mark and he was not needed for late work, and on Sunday afternoons. They established the habit of walking. There was a path along the creek west of the settlement that she liked, lined with bare sycamores that in winter looked like white bones against the gray sky, and that she said would be spectacular in the spring. He trusted her on this. In those walks and evenings, they built something carefully and deliberately, the way people who have both been careful for a long time build things, with attention, with honesty, without the shortcuts that sometimes pass for speed. He told her things about himself that he had not told people he had known for years. She told him things in return, and he listened with the full attention that she had not always been given, and he could see her adjusting to it, to being fully heard, the way an eye adjusts to good light after a long time in the dark. In February, Jonas Birch asked him to ride down to a cattle market in Waco to look at purchasing a small additional herd, and Phineas went and did the job and found himself standing on 2nd Street outside Aldous Webb's law office, and on an impulse he went in. Webb remembered him. They spoke about the Valley Mills property, and Webb, with the practiced eye of a lawyer who knows land, gave his opinion that the 40 acres was worth developing, that the river bottomland was fertile, that the stone foundation on the property suggested someone had once had intentions for it, and that a small house and some cleared fields would not only improve its value but make it genuinely livable. Phineas rode back to Crockett's Crossing with thoughts that had been circulating since December now taking a more definite shape. He did not rush it. He had said he would earn it, and he meant to earn it properly, which in his understanding meant among other things that Lydia should trust not just his intentions but his steadiness, his capacity to stay when things were not easy, to show up when the weather was poor and the work was hard and the mood was difficult. He worked for Birch through the winter with diligence, and he showed up for Lydia with the same, and the months moved through their seasons like the river moved through the bottomland, with a direction and a purpose that neither hurried nor doubted itself. March came with a spectacular and entirely indiscriminate explosion of wildflowers that Lydia had not exaggerated. The creek path had bluebonnets and paintbrush and little yellow flowers whose names she knew, and which she told him as they walked, and he listened and forgot most of them immediately but stored away the fact of her knowing them, the way she carried knowledge as though it were a natural and necessary part of being alive. In late March, on a Sunday afternoon, he took her to see the Valley Mills land for the 2nd time. He had ridden out there twice on his own in the month since December, walking the property, thinking. He had not told her about those visits. They rode out together in the mild spring afternoon, and when they arrived, the change from December was remarkable. The cottonwoods were fully leaved, bright new green along the river, and the grass was tall and green and moving in the warm south wind, and the land looked like something in a painting that you would not believe was real. She reined in at the edge of the property and took it in, and he watched her face. "It is even more beautiful than I remembered," she said. "Come and see something," he said, and rode toward the stone foundation near the river. He had been to Valley Mills 4 weeks earlier on a day off from Birch's ranch, and had done some work at the foundation site. He had cleared it of the brush that had grown up through it over the years, and had stacked some additional limestone nearby, and had drawn, on a piece of paper that he now carried in his breast pocket alongside the original folded paper with her name on it, a rough plan of a house. He dismounted and she dismounted beside him, and he showed her the cleared foundation and then took out the paper with the plan and showed her that too. She looked at the plan for a long time, and then she looked at the foundation, and then she looked at him. "This is a plan for a house," she said. "It is," he said. "On my land." "Yes," he said. "With your permission." He held her gaze. "I want to build it with you, for us, if you want that. I am not asking you to decide that today, but I want you to know that is what I am asking, so there is no confusion." She was quiet for a long moment, standing in the spring grass with the river running close and the cottonwoods bright above them. "You planned this," she said. "I thought about it," he said, "for quite some time. You are a careful man," she said. "I try to be," he said, "about things that matter." She looked at the foundation and then at the river and then at the plan in his hands and then at him, and the afternoon was warm and full of the sound of water and birdsong and the wind in the new leaves. "I want that," she said clearly. "I want all of that." He exhaled in a way that he hoped was not too obviously the release of a great deal of accumulated tension, and she laughed softly, reading him anyway. "You are not as certain as you seemed," she said. "No," he admitted, "but a man has to stand for something." She stepped forward and took his face in her hands, both hands, steady and warm, cupping his jaw, and she looked at him for a moment with her amber-brown eyes, and then she kissed him, there on her 40 acres in the spring sunshine, beside the stone foundation of a house that did not yet exist, and the river ran its benediction over the limestone, and the cottonwood leaves were the particular bright green of new things that have not yet learned to be otherwise. He put his hands on her waist and kissed her back, and when they parted she was still holding his face, and they were both breathing with the slight unevenness of people who have been wanting something for a while and have now been given it. "I should tell you," she said, with the slight unsteadiness still in her voice, "that I have been in love with you since February." "I have been in love with you," he said, "since you answered the door with chalk on your hand." She stared at him. "That was December." "Yes," he said. She laughed, fully and helplessly, and it was the best sound he had ever heard in his life. He proposed formally on an evening in April on Mrs. Pratt's front porch, with the evening star visible over the pecan trees and the creek frogs calling in the dark. He did not have a ring yet. There was no jeweler in Crockett's Crossing, and the nearest one was in Meridian. But he proposed with the directness and sincerity that characterized everything he did, and she accepted with the same. He rode to Meridian the following Saturday and bought a ring from a jeweler there. A simple gold band with a small garnet set in it, dark red and genuine. And when he put it on her finger that Sunday, she held her hand up and looked at it in the light and smiled in the way that bypassed every other expression and went straight to the thing underneath. They were married in the church at Crockett's Crossing on the 15th of June, 1873, which was a Saturday of such extravagant perfection, blue sky, warm breeze, every wildflower apparently in collusion, that Mrs. Pratt declared it was providential, and everyone agreed with her. The whole settlement came. Jonas Birch and his wife came, and Thomas Reeves and Eli Craft came, and the minister who rode a circuit through these small settlements performed the ceremony with evident pleasure and some eloquence. Mrs. Hattie Draper, the woman in Meridian who had sent Phineas toward Crockett's Crossing back in December, had heard about the wedding through the remarkable informal communications network of this part of Texas and came unbidden, and wept copiously and happily throughout, and Lydia embraced her with real warmth. Phineas stood at the front of that church in his best clothes, which were considerably better than the trail-worn state in which he had arrived 6 months prior, and watched Lydia walk down the aisle in a dress of dark blue that she had made herself over the preceding weeks. And the morning light through the church windows was in her hair, and her eyes were luminous, and her chin was slightly lifted in the way it lifted when she was trying to manage her emotions and not entirely succeeding. He was grateful, in that moment and every moment after, for the red Nevada dust and the dying man, and the piece of paper with 2 words on it. He was grateful in a way that went all the way down to the ground. The summer was devoted to building. Phineas arranged with Jonas Birch to reduce his hours through July and August, promising to return to full work in the fall when the cattle required more attention. He hired Thomas Reeves and a man from Valley Mills named Sam Garrett, who was a proper carpenter, and whose skills Phineas needed for the parts of house building that went beyond his own competence, which were not few. Lydia's school had its summer break, and she worked alongside them without any affectation about what was or was not suitable for a woman to do. She hauled limestone, she mixed mortar, she held beams while they were being set, and she made the decisions about the interior arrangements of the house because it was her land and her home, and she had opinions about every room. The house rose through July and into August, limestone walls thick enough to keep cool in the summer and warm in the winter, a wide porch on the south side facing the river, 2 rooms downstairs and a loft above, a stone fireplace in the main room that Sam Garrett built with the skill of an artist. Phineas dug the well himself over the course of 3 hot days in August, and when the water came up clean and cold, he sat on the edge of the well with his shirt drenched, and felt a satisfaction so complete that it was almost frightening. They moved in on the 1st of September, 1873, which was almost exactly 1 year to the day after Phineas had found Edmund Covington dying in the Nevada dust. The house smelled of new timber and limestone and the river, and in the evening they sat on the south porch with the night sounds coming in across the water, and he thought about that red dust and that folded paper and the improbable chain of events that had assembled itself between that moment and this one. "Are you happy?" she asked. "Beyond what I know what to do with," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat in the warm September night and listened to the river. In the fall of 1873, Lydia closed her school at Crockett's Crossing, not with any drama, but with the understanding that she had handed over something she had built carefully, and that the woman who took it over was capable. And she established a new school in Valley Mills, where the community had been without a regular teacher for nearly 2 years. The school was in a room that the town agreed to maintain for the purpose, and by November she had 14 students, ranging in age from 6 to 15, and she was exactly herself in front of them, which meant they worked hard and learned a great deal and were, most of them, grateful for it even when they were not aware of being so. Phineas continued to work for Jonas Birch through the fall drive, and earned enough in the process to begin the clearing and planting of the lower field on the 40 acres, which Sam Garrett had confirmed was prime ground for corn and sorghum. They hired a young man from Valley Mills named Peter Haskins to help with the agricultural work, and he turned out to be diligent and good-natured, and became a fixture of their days through that winter. There was a moment in October when the situation in Texas confronted them with the reality of the time in a way that was not comfortable and could not be looked away from. A man came to the door of their house one evening, a Comanche man of about 40, and he was traveling with his family, his wife and 2 young children, and they were thin and clearly exhausted, and the man asked, in careful and practiced English, whether there was food to spare. The situation of the Comanche and other Plains tribes in Texas in 1873 was that of a people being systematically dispossessed of their land and their way of life by forces that Phineas understood clearly enough to feel deeply uncomfortable about his own position within that landscape. The Red River War was still nearly a year away, and the full disaster of the reservation policies had not yet reached its worst point, but the direction of it was plain enough to anyone willing to look. Phineas said yes and invited them in. Lydia fed them from what they had, which was enough, and the man, whose name was Tall Bear and who spoke English because he had been required to learn it, thanked them with a dignity that made the gratitude feel like a gift given rather than received. They stayed the night in the barn, and in the morning Lydia packed food for the road, and they left early, the 2 children sleeping on the wagon bench. Phineas and Lydia stood on the porch and watched them go, and neither spoke for a moment. "I know what this land is," she said finally, "what it was before it was ours." "Yes," he said. "I don't know what the right thing to do is," she said. "I don't think there is a right thing available to do, given everything that has already been done. But I know that when someone comes to the door, we feed them." "Yes," he said, "we do." It was a small thing in the vast, terrible sweep of what was happening in that country in those years, and neither of them was under any illusion that it was sufficient or that it addressed the injustice at the root of it. But they did it, consistently and without drama, whenever there was occasion to do it, and it was the kind of people they were. November brought the first rains, and the 40 acres drank them gratefully, and Phineas walked the lower field in the gray drizzle, and felt the loam go soft under his boots, and thought about the spring planting with a pleasure that surprised him, coming from a man who had always reckoned himself primarily a cattleman. In December, 3 months after they had moved into the house, Lydia told him she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen in the morning, while he was drinking his first coffee, and she was standing at the window looking at the river with an expression he could not quite read, and that made him set down the coffee very carefully. "Are you well?" he asked first. "I am perfectly well," she said. "Healthier than I have ever been, actually." She turned from the window and looked at him. "I am going to have a baby, Phineas." He was across the kitchen and had her in his arms before he had consciously decided to move, and she laughed and he held her, and the December light came in through the window over the river and everything was as it should be. When? He managed against her hair. July, she said. I think. He pulled back and looked at her face, and her eyes were bright, and she was smiling with a fullness that he had never seen in her before. And he thought that it was remarkable how a person could keep revealing new dimensions of joy. Are you frightened? He asked. A little, she said honestly. Are you? Considerably, he said, which made her laugh again. Winter passed with the particular sweetness of a winter in which you are warm and housed and fed and in love and expecting a child, which is to say that it's cold and it's dark and its limitations were almost irrelevant against the larger light of things. The house was good. The thick limestone walls did exactly what Sam Garrett had said they would, keeping the cold out and the warmth in. And the fireplace in the main room was the heart of the house, in a way that the architect of the original unbuilt foundation would have approved of. Phineas built a cradle over the course of several evenings in January and February, working on it after supper by lamplight while Lydia marked her students' work at the table nearby. And the cradle was not the work of a master craftsman, but it was made with the particular care that comes from making something for a person you love beyond your usual capacity for expression. Lydia ran her hand along the edge of it one evening and said, "It is beautiful." "It is adequate," he said. "It is beautiful," she said firmly, "and I will hear no argument." He had learned by this point when to offer no argument. Spring came in with its usual extravagance, and Phineas planted the lower field with corn and the upper field with sorghum, and Lydia planted a garden behind the house with the focused intensity of a person who has always wanted a garden and has finally been given the proper circumstances for one. She planted tomatoes and beans and squash and herbs that she identified by their Latin names, which she had learned from a book, and she had opinions about the spacing of rows that she expressed with cheerful authority. In April, they received a letter from Aldous Webb, who had been made aware of the property's development by some communication of the kind that tends to flow freely in small-town Texas, saying that the land was now fully and indisputably of record in Lydia's name, that all claims were clear, and that in his professional opinion the improvements they had made had substantially increased its value. He wished them well. It was a generous letter, and Lydia read it twice and filed it carefully. Eli Craft came to visit in May, having left Jonah's Birch's employ and started his own small operation east of Valley Mills, and was so comprehensively cheerful about the house and the land and the obvious happiness of the Shepards that he was impossible not to like. He stayed 2 nights and ate everything put in front of him, and told long stories about cattle-related mishaps, with an enthusiasm that had both Phineas and Lydia unable to eat supper for laughing, which was as good an evening as either of them had spent in recent memory. June was warm and long, and the lower field was growing tall, and Lydia was showing clearly now, and had adjusted her routines with the practical common sense that characterized everything she did. She taught her school through to mid-June, and then closed it for the summer, arranging for a woman in town to take the younger students through the hot months, and settled into the days at the house on the river with the particular peace of a woman who has built her life carefully and is now inhabiting it fully. On the 3rd of July, 1874, Lydia gave birth to a son. The labor was long, and Phineas spent most of it on the south porch in a state of controlled anxiety that fooled no one, least of all the midwife Mrs. Anna Caldwell, who came from Valley Mills and was 60 years old, and had delivered more babies in central Texas than she cared to count, and who sent him firmly outside when his hovering became, as she put it, a public health concern. The boy came in the early morning hours, just as the night was beginning to lose its edges, and his first sound was a declaration that silenced every other noise in the world for Phineas, who heard it from the porch and put his hand flat on the porch railing to keep himself steady. Mrs. Caldwell opened the bedroom door and told him he could come in, and he came in and found Lydia in the bed with the child on her chest, and she was exhausted and radiant and entirely herself, and she looked up at him with the particular expression that has no name but that he knew from that moment he would carry with him until his last day. "Come and see him," she said. He came and saw him. He was red-faced and dark-haired and furious about everything, and he was the most astonishing thing Phineas had ever seen in his life. "What do we call him?" Phineas asked. "I was thinking," she said, "Edmund." He looked up from the baby to her face, and his throat did something that required him to wait a moment. "Yes," he said, "Edmund." Edmund James Shepard, given the middle name for Phineas's father, entered the world on the 4th of July, which Mrs. Caldwell declared was entirely fitting for a boy who had come in fighting and would likely continue in the same vein, and which Lydia said was a lot of noise for a 2-day-old to be competing with, and which Phineas said, quietly and to himself, was just about right for a child whose existence traced back to a piece of paper pressed into his father's hand by a dying man in the Nevada dust. Edmund grew through that summer and fall with the vigorous determination of a healthy child, and the house on the bosque absorbed this new life into itself with the ease of a place that was built for it. The cradle Phineas had made in January sat in the main room near the fireplace, and in the evenings while the child slept in it, they sat nearby, Lydia with her book and Phineas with whatever work required evening attention or, more often, his own reading, which was a habit he had developed late and took to stubbornly. And the fire and the lamp and the sleeping child and the river running beyond the window composed a picture that Phineas sometimes stopped himself in the middle of and held fully in his awareness, deliberately, the way you hold a moment when you know you are inside something worth remembering. The farm produced a good first harvest in the fall of 1874. The corn came in above what he had hoped, the sorghum likewise, and Peter Haskins, who had stayed on as a regular hand and was by now as much a part of the operation as anyone, was quietly proud of the result in the way of someone who has worked hard and wants to see it mean something. There was a day in September, near the anniversary of Edmund Covington's death, when Phineas rode out on his own for an hour along the river. He did not tell Lydia where he was going or why, not because it was a secret, but because it was something he needed to do privately. He rode along the water and let Atlas find his own pace, and he thought about the man who had died in the Nevada dust and what that man had given him without knowing it, had given him entirely by accident, by the simple geography of lying in a particular stretch of road when Phineas happened to be riding past. He thought about how close he had come to not stopping. There had been a split second before he had fully registered what he was seeing, in which the shape in the dust had been ambiguous enough that he might have ridden on. He thought about that fraction of a second with something that was not quite awe and not quite fear, but was a close relative of both. He thought about Lydia, teaching her school in Valley Mills and feeding Edmund his breakfast and laughing at something Eli had written in a letter that had arrived last week. He thought about Edmund in the cradle by the fire. He thought about the stone house on the bosque and the corn harvest and the well with its cold, clean water. He reached into his breast pocket and took out the original piece of paper, which he had never thrown away. It was folded now along lines that had been folded and refolded many times, the paper soft with handling. He unfolded it and looked at the 2 words in Edmund Covington's faded pencil, and the afternoon light came through the cottonwood leaves in flickering pieces, and the river ran past, and the 2 words were as clear as they had been on a September afternoon 2 years ago in the Nevada dust. Lydia Covington. He folded the paper and put it back in his breast pocket, right against his heart. He rode home. The years that followed were the years of a life built properly and inhabited with care. Lydia returned to her school in the fall of 1874 and taught there for the next several years, and her reputation grew in that part of Texas. As a teacher, of genuine quality students came from farms several miles distant because word had spread, and Valley Mills grew modestly but steadily, and the school grew with it. She was also a member of the small group of women in the county who were quietly and persistently organizing around the question of what education for girls in this part of Texas could look like if someone made it a priority, which several of them were determined to do, and which Phineas supported without reservation, because it was obviously right, and because Lydia's intelligence and determination in this arena were among the things he most admired about her. He expanded the farm through careful management and the trust he had built with Jonas Birch, who brought him in on a modest cattle venture in 1875 that gave Phineas a small ownership share in a herd. By 1876, he had enough saved to purchase an adjoining 10 acres from the family to the north land that extended the river frontage and gave him room to run a small additional herd of his own. He was not a large rancher and did not aspire to be one, but the combination of farming and cattle suited him in a way that pure ranch work alone had not, and the land was his in a way that working for other men's land had never been. In the spring of 1876, Lydia told him she was expecting again. This time he was less terrified and more immediately, straightforwardly joyful, which she noted with amusement. "You were considerably more composed about this than you were 2 years ago," she said. "I have had some time to get used to the idea," he said, "of being responsible for other people." "And how has that suited you?" she asked. "It has suited me," he said, "better than anything I have ever done." The second child was born in October of 1876, a girl with her mother's auburn hair and her father's dark eyes, and they named her Margaret for Lydia's mother, and she arrived in the world at a somewhat more civilized hour than her brother had, which Mrs. Caldwell, returning for the occasion, declared to be a considerable improvement in planning. Edmund, who was 2 years old and had strong opinions about most things, received his sister with a wariness that gradually, over the following weeks, converted itself into a proprietary interest that expressed itself as following her everywhere and attempting to narrate her activities to any adult within earshot. The house on the Bosque acquired the sounds of young children, which are a particular and specific kind of noise that cannot be mistaken for anything else, and which the thick limestone walls contained rather well, and which Phineas found that he was constitutionally unable to find objectionable regardless of the hour or the volume. He built an addition to the house in the summer of 1877, a second room upstairs, to accommodate the expanding family, and a proper kitchen that had been one of the things Lydia had wanted since they first moved in. Sam Garrett came back to help with the construction, older now and slightly slower but no less skilled, and the addition went up in 8 weeks, and the new kitchen was a room of real quality, with a proper iron stove and good counter space, and a window over the garden that Lydia stood at every morning and considered the most satisfactory view in the house. Thomas Reeves, the quiet man from Georgia who had worked with Phineas on Birch's ranch, came to see them in the fall of 1877 with his wife, a small and sharp-witted woman named Dorothy who had grown up in Virginia and had the kind of dry humor that ambushes you from directions you're not watching. They stayed a week, which was one of those visits that deepens a friendship permanently. Dorothy and Lydia became close friends over that week, with the natural efficiency of 2 intelligent women who recognize in each other a kindred quality, and the correspondence between them after the visit was one of the more consistent and nourishing elements of Lydia's life over the following years. In 1878, Peter Haskins took a wife, a young woman from Valley Mills named Clara, coincidentally the same name as Lydia's horse, which Lydia declared was an excellent omen, and they built their own small house on the edge of the Shepard property, where Peter continued to work, and Clara became a neighbor in the full and generous sense of the word, appearing with practical assistance and warm company at all the moments when practical assistance and warm company were most needed. The late 1870s were years in which the wider Texas frontier was undergoing profound changes, and not all of them pleasant or clean. The Red River War of 1874 had ended the organized resistance of the Comanche and Kiowa to reservation confinement, and the land that had been theirs for generations was being rapidly absorbed into ranching and farming operations. Phineas and Lydia were aware of this in a way that was not entirely comfortable, and they spoke of it honestly between themselves, and they continued the practice they had established from their first winter in the house of opening their door to anyone who came to it hungry. The settlers who came through in those years were a mixed human inventory, some hopeful and industrious, some damaged and dangerous, most somewhere in the complicated middle that constitutes actual human beings navigating difficult circumstances. Phineas had occasion to refuse entry to one man who had the look and the manner of someone whose arrival at your door preceded trouble, and to help another man whose wagon had broken down 5 miles up the road, and who turned out to be a printer from Ohio, who had a press he was hauling to a new paper in San Antonio, and who talked without pause for 3 hours about the state of journalism in America, which Phineas found more interesting than he expected. The Valley Mills School was officially recognized by the county in 1878, which meant regular funding and the formal establishment of a school board, and Lydia was named the head teacher with a salary that was still less than a male counterpart would have received, and that she noted this disparity about with the calm clarity she brought to injustices she was not going to pretend were acceptable. She took the position and the salary and continued making the case through every channel available to her, and she was not the kind of woman who needed to be told that progress was slow to be patient about it. She had been patient all her life. She was also persistent all her life, which was a more active posture. In 1879, their third child arrived, a boy they named James for Phineas's father, and he came into the world looking so much like his grandfather's one surviving photograph that Phineas went slightly silent for a moment when he first saw him, and Lydia, who knew her husband well enough by this point to read silences accurately, reached out and took his hand. "He has your family in his face," she said. "He does," Phineas said, and the word family landed in him with a warm and substantial weight that he had not been entirely prepared for. James was, from the beginning, a child of considerable placidity, which was a relief after Edmund's passionate engagement with every aspect of existence and Margaret's forthright insistence on understanding the mechanical workings of anything she encountered, including the well pump, the stove, and once the hinge of the back door, which she had dismantled at age 3 to universal consternation and reassembled, largely correctly, herself. By 1880, the Shepard property on the Bosque had grown to 60 acres, with the original 40 plus the additional 10 Phineas had purchased in 76, and a further 10 that had become available when a neighboring family moved on to New Mexico territory. The farm was productive and the small cattle operation was modest but solid, and the house had its addition, and its kitchen, and its south porch from which the river was visible year-round and audible in the evenings, and there were 3 children and 2 horses, and a considerable quantity of chickens, and a dog named Gus, who was of indeterminate breed and absolute loyalty. There was an evening in the late summer of 1880 when Phineas and Lydia sat on the south porch after the children were in bed, which was a luxury they had learned to value highly for its rarity and its quality, and the evening was warm and the river was catching the last light, and the fireflies were making their soft intermittent declarations in the tall grass along the bank. Edmund would have liked this, Lydia said, meaning her uncle. It was not the first time she had said something like this, and he always understood who she meant. He would, Phineas agreed. He seemed like a man who liked good things. He was. She was quiet for a moment. He used to visit when I was small. He would bring things, books, always books, and once a compass, which I thought was the most wonderful thing I had ever seen. He knew so many things about the world and he shared them without condescension, the way some adults can with children. She paused. I think he would have been happy to know how it all came out. "I like to think so," Phineas said. She turned to look at him in the evening light, and she was 31 years old now, and the years had deepened her beauty rather than diminishing it, the way beauty that is rooted in something real tends to do. "I think about the piece of paper," she said. "2 words, the chance of it." "I think about it too," he said. "I still have it." "I know," she said. "I have seen you keep it." He reached into his shirt pocket and took it out, still folded along the same lines, the paper more fragile now than it had been but still whole, and he held it between his fingers in the evening light. "Do you want it?" he said. She reached out and took it gently and unfolded it with care, and she sat for a long moment looking at her own name in her uncle's handwriting. "He wrote this," she said quietly. "He did. And gave it to you. He did." She folded it again along its old lines and held it for a moment, and then she reached over and tucked it back into his shirt pocket, pressing her hand flat against it for a moment. "You keep it," she said. "It belongs with you." He put his hand over hers, and they sat in the evening with the fireflies and the river and the sound of the 3 children sleeping soundly inside the stone house. And the 8 years since a red Nevada afternoon assembled themselves quietly in the air around them. And every mile of it, every cold camp and dusty trail and doubtful moment, resolved into this particular Thursday evening in August of 1880, which was not remarkable by any external measure and was everything by every measure that actually counted. The following years were full. Edmund grew into a boy of thoughtful intensity who was, despite being only his father's son in the biological sense, unmistakably his mother's child in the intellectual sense. He read everything he could find and had questions about all of it, and Lydia's school benefited from having a student of his quality in it. And he benefited from having a teacher of her quality who was also his mother, and therefore not susceptible to his occasional attempts to argue his way out of work. Margaret, at 6 and 7 and 8, was precisely the force of nature that her early dismantling of the back door hinge had suggested she would be. She was interested in how things worked, in why the field produced more in some years than others, in how the well's water level changed with the seasons, in the behavior of the river during flood season and during drought. She followed her father around the farm asking questions that were sometimes ahead of her age, and Phineas answered them as directly and honestly as he could, which she repaid with a trust in his answers that he found remarkably moving. James was quiet and observant and gentle with animals, in the way of someone who has a natural affinity for them that goes beyond fondness into communication. By the time he was 4, he had an understanding with Gus the dog that appeared to operate outside of normal language, and by the time he was 6, he could handle Clara the mare with a softness that made even the experienced Phineas pay attention. In 1882, a school board meeting in Valley Mills raised the possibility of building a proper schoolhouse, separate from the rented room that had served for 9 years. Lydia had been making this case for 4 of those 9 years, and when it finally moved from possibility to decision, she came home that evening and sat down at the kitchen table and put her face in her hands for a moment with a weariness that was not exhaustion but was the particular release of something long held. Phineas sat down beside her and put his arm around her. "They said yes," she said, into her hands. "I know," he said. "Clara Haskins was at the store when you rode past and she told Peter." She looked up at him with reddened eyes and a slightly disbelieving expression. "Nothing is private in this town." "No," he said, "but people are happy for you." She made a sound that was half laugh and half something else, and he held her until the something else subsided and the laugh won out. The schoolhouse was built in the summer of 1882, and Lydia designed its interior herself with the precision of someone who had been thinking about optimal classroom organization for 9 years and had therefore worked out every detail. It had large south-facing windows for light, proper desks rather than converted furniture, a good board on the wall that did not streak, and enough room for 25 students, which was twice what she currently had, and which she expected to need within 3 years based on Valley Mills's rate of growth. She stood in the finished room on the day before the first school day of the fall term, and Phineas stood beside her, and the room smelled of new wood, and the afternoon light came through the south windows and made everything bright. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. "I have wanted this," she said, "for a very long time." "I know you have," he said. She turned and put her arms around him in the empty schoolroom, and he held her there in the slanting afternoon light. And outside the window the town of Valley Mills went about its afternoon, and the locust trees along the street made their late summer sound, and the sky above was the same uncompromising Texas blue it had been 10 years ago, when he had ridden into Crockett's Crossing on a December afternoon, looking for a woman whose name was written on a piece of paper. By 1884, Edmund Covington Shepard was 10 years old, and reading at a level that Lydia said required her to start sending for books from San Antonio, because she had exhausted what the local stores could provide. Margaret was 8 and had established a small and functional weather observation practice in the garden, noting daily conditions in a notebook Phineas had given her, and developing theories about weather patterns that her parents did not take lightly, and her school classmates found exotic. James was 5 and had, with patient assistance from Peter Haskins, learned to ride. The farm was the most productive it had been. Phineas had added a small apple orchard along the north fence line, something he had been planning for 3 years, and that would not bear fruit for several more, which he considered an investment in the patience he had spent enough years developing to be able to trust. He had a reputation in the county as a reliable and fair man in cattle dealings, and Jonas Birch, now in his 60s and winding down his more active operations, had told Phineas straightforwardly that if anyone in the region could be trusted with the management of a complicated cattle deal, he would recommend Phineas first. There was a day in the late fall of 1884, on the anniversary of nothing in particular but a fine, cold, clear morning when the Bosque was low, and the limestone in the riverbed was visible under clear water, when Phineas found himself walking the perimeter of the 40 acres that had first brought him here, the original property. Now the core of a larger operation, but still identifiable by the riverside cottonwoods and the stone house, and the well he had dug himself with his hands in the hot August of 1873. He walked slowly, not with any particular destination, and he thought about the man he had been when he arrived here, 26 years old, trail-worn and uncertain in ways he had not been willing to fully admit, moving through the world with competence and without a fixed direction, doing the next necessary thing because the next necessary thing was always available to do, and that was enough. He was 38 now. The dark hair had a beginning of gray at the temples, which Lydia said looked distinguished, and which he suspected she was being charitable about. He was still lean, but in a way that had filled out with the years, less the wiriness of a young man and more the settled strength of one who has been doing physical work consistently, and with good intention for a long time. He had laugh lines at the corners of his eyes that he had not had at 26, and a scar on his left hand from a fencing incident in 78 that had healed cleanly, and hands that were cracked and brown from years of outdoor work, and that had held his wife and his children, and had built the walls he lived inside. He stopped at the old stone foundation, which was of course now the foundation of the house itself. Sam Garrett had incorporated it seamlessly into the new construction, and he stood with his hand on the limestone wall of the house and thought that there was no way, on that September afternoon in Nevada 12 years ago, that he could have known what was in the paper pressed into his hand by a dying man. No way to know that 2 words in faded pencil would be the axis around which the rest of his life would turn. He heard the back door open and Lydia came out into the cold morning with her coat on, holding 2 cups of coffee, and she walked across the frosty ground with the sure-footed practicality of a woman who does not look down when she knows the ground. She handed him his cup and stood beside him looking at the river. "You were gone a long time," she said. "The children asked about you." "I was thinking," he said. "Good thoughts or troubling ones?" "Good," he said. "Very good." She looked at him sidelong with those amber-brown eyes, and the cold morning put color in her cheeks, and she was 35 and entirely herself, more entirely herself than she had been at any earlier point, which was saying something. "Tell me one of them," she said. He thought for a moment, looking at the river. "I was thinking," he said, "that I have been grateful every day since the day I found you, and that the gratitude has not diminished. It has only gotten larger." She was quiet beside him, her shoulder against his arm, both of them looking at the bosque moving cold and clear over the limestone in the November morning. "I was thinking the same thing," she said. Not in those exact words, but the same thing. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they stood on the south porch of the house they had built together, on the land that a dying man's love for his niece had preserved, in the lives that a piece of paper with 2 words on it had made possible, and the river ran past in the November cold, and the cottonwoods stood bare and silver, and the sky was clear all the way to the edge of the world. Inside the house, they could hear Margaret explaining something to Edmund in a voice of considerable conviction, and James's lighter voice asking a question, and the sound of the kitchen stove being opened to add wood, and the dog Gus moving across the floor with his characteristic uneven gait, and all of it. Every ordinary morning sound of a house fully lived in was the architecture of a life that had been built from an improbable beginning, and a long ride, and a willingness to stop when the road offered something that required stopping for. Phineas pressed the folded paper in his breast pocket with the flat of his hand, the same instinctive motion he had made since the September afternoon in Nevada when he had first tucked it there, and felt it against his heart where it had always been. Lydia Covington, 2 words that had become everything. He looked at his wife in the November morning, and she looked at him, and the years and the miles and the gratitude were all present in that look. And the river ran on past the stone house and the bare cottonwoods and the 60 acres of river bottomland, where 3 children were growing up knowing exactly where they belonged. And the piece of paper against his heart was softer than it had once been, but was still whole, and would be whole for as long as he was. And after that it would belong to Edmund, who would keep it whole for his own children and his children's children, because some things are worth keeping, and the ones worth keeping are always the ones that started with a decision to stop, and a hand pressed into yours, and a name you didn't know yet that turned out to be the most important name in the world.